The morning they changed the locks, Renata Cruz was still in her office on the second floor, going through the quarterly accounts the way she had every third Monday for 22 years. She heard the click before she heard her brother's voices. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A soft, final sound that carried through the floor like a word spoken in a language she had never been taught but somehow understood completely. She was 53 years old. She had gray threading through black hair she no longer bothered to dye, reading glasses she kept losing and finding again in her cardigan pocket, and a habit of arriving at Cruz Family Hardware an hour before anyone else because the mornings, the slow creak of the building settling into the day, had always felt like hers. That morning it was November. Cold enough for frost on the windows. She had brought her own coffee in a thermos from home, the same one she had used for years, dented along the side where it had fallen from the seat of her car the winter after her father died. She heard the click. She heard Marcos's voice below, then Dario's, lower, flatter, the voice he used when the decision had already been made and the only thing left was the administration of it. She came down the stairs with her thermos in her hand. Marcos was standing near the front counter, arms crossed, and Dario was beside the door with a set of keys she did not recognize. Two men she had never seen were waiting near the loading bay entrance, the kind of men who move furniture and ask no questions. "Renata," Dario said. His voice was controlled. He was 3 years younger than her and had learned that control from their father, though he had forgotten everything else their father taught. She looked at the keys. She looked at Marcos. He had always been the one to break eye contact first, and he did now, turning slightly toward the window where the November street held no interest but gave him somewhere to put his face. "What is this?" she said. Dario set the keys on the counter. "The company has been restructured," he said. "As of this morning, the ownership stake has been consolidated. We've spoken with the attorney and the documents are filed." She had known this was coming the way you know a storm is building, by the quality of the air, by the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, by the morning 3 weeks before when she had found Marcos photographing the inventory with his phone and he had said it was for insurance purposes with the particular flatness of a man rehearsing. She had known. She had chosen not to believe it. "You cannot do this," she said. Dario said, "Dad signed the operating agreement 4 years ago. Your name was removed in the amendment. You were CC'd on the letter." She remembered a letter. She remembered a Tuesday afternoon, an email from the attorney's office, dense and formal, which she had filed without reading because there had been a delivery dispute with a supplier and a staff member had called in sick and the day had been the kind of day that swallowed everything. She had meant to go back to it. "That was my share," she said. "My ownership stake. Dad built this company for all 3 of us. The company Dario said belongs to whoever holds the shares." He did not say it with cruelty. That was the particular wound of it. He said it the way someone states a fact about weather or distance. Measured, exact, already beyond the reach of argument. Renata looked at the 2 men by the loading bay. One of them had a clipboard. The other was looking at his phone. Marco still had not turned away from the window. She had started working at Cruz Family Hardware when she was 17. Her father, Edmundo Cruz, had founded it on a borrowed $8,000 and a used delivery truck in 1981, selling nails, lumber, and whatever else the contractors in their part of Córdoba County needed. Renata had grown up on the smell of sawdust and motor oil, had learned to read invoices before she learned to drive, had spent 3 years in the city studying business management and come back not because she couldn't find something better but because she had never wanted anything better. This was the work. This was the place. She had taken on the bookkeeping, then the purchasing, then supplier relationships, then the expansion into the industrial supply contracts that had tripled the company's revenue over the last 12 years. While Marcos managed the floor and Dario handled sales and their father grew older and slower and finally sat in the back office with his coffee and his crossword puzzles and let his children run the thing he had made, Renata was the one who kept it alive. She knew the payment terms with every supplier. She knew which contractor would pay late and which would vanish entirely. She knew where the bodies were buried in every ledger they had ever kept. And now she was standing in the front room with her thermos and her reading glasses, and the two men with the clipboard were moving toward the back. "What about my salary?" she said. "What about the accounts? What about 22 years? Dario reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. She recognized the gesture. She had seen her father do it once, years ago, when a long-time employee had to be let go and her father had stood in this same room and handed over the envelope himself because he would not let someone else do it. Dario was nothing like their father. "There's a severance figure inside," Dario said. "It's fair. You should have a lawyer look at it." He paused. "I'd like this to stay out of court, Renata. For the family." She took the envelope. She did not open it. She looked at Marcos one more time, and he finally turned from the window, and his face held the particular expression of a man who has convinced himself that what he is doing is necessary, which is the most dangerous kind of expression, because it closes every door. She walked out the front of Cruz Family Hardware with the envelope in one hand and the thermos in the other. The door closed behind her. She heard the new key turn in the lock. The street was cold and bright. Her car was parked at the curb, the same place she had parked it every morning for years, close to the elm tree that the city kept threatening to remove and never did. She sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. She opened the envelope. The severance was $4,200. 22 years. 12 of them carrying the business on work Marcos and Dario had never bothered to understand. $4,200 and a door locked behind her while the men with the clipboard moved through the place she had built. She put the envelope on the passenger seat. She started the engine. She drove to the house she had rented for 9 years on the east side of Córdoba, the small yellow house with the broken gutters she kept meaning to fix and the garden her neighbor Peta helped her tend on Sunday afternoons. She sat in the kitchen and drank the rest of her thermos coffee cold and looked at the wall. The clock above the stove read 9:47. She had been inside Cruz Family Hardware 9 hours earlier and it felt like a different century. She thought about her father. Edmundo Cruz had been a man who saved things. Not in the hoarding sense, not in the sentimental clutter that collects in corners of old houses, but deliberately, intentionally, the way a carpenter saves good wood for a purpose he hasn't named yet. He saved old contracts in labeled folders. He saved photographs in albums organized by year. He kept a notebook in his desk drawer where he wrote down the names of people who had treated him with honesty and the names of people who had not, in 2 separate columns, without comment. After he died 4 years ago, Renata and her brothers had divided the estate. The house went to Marcos, as the eldest. The truck and the tools went to Dario. Renata received the company shares and the personal effects, which were a watch, a rosary, 2 boxes of photographs, and a sealed envelope the attorney had handed over with a note in her father's handwriting that said simply, "For Renata, when the time comes." She had put the envelope in the drawer of her nightstand. She had not opened it. Her father had a habit of writing letters to be opened at specific moments, letters tucked into birthday cards, into the lining of her luggage when she left for college, into the frame of a photograph he'd given her on the day she returned home from the city. She had learned to wait for the right moment rather than open them early, because he always knew when the right moment would be better than she did. She went to the bedroom. She opened the nightstand drawer. The envelope was there, cream-colored, her name on the front in his careful hand. She had looked at it many times over 4 years. She had picked it up and set it back down. She had nearly opened it twice, once after a hard week at the company and once on his birthday, then stopped herself both times because she could not explain the instinct except to say that the letter did not feel ready and so she was not. She picked it up. She held it. It felt ready now. She took it to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened it carefully, the way he had taught her to open anything that mattered, without tearing, working the flap slowly, respecting the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, and beneath it, a smaller envelope, and beneath that, a key. The key was old. Not antique ornate, Nothing theatrical, just a solid brass key worn smooth where a hand had held it many times, with a number stamped into the bow and a small paper tag tied through the hole with a length of twine. The tag read, Cruz Annex, 14, Vela Road, Lot 7. She did not recognize the address. She unfolded the letter. His handwriting was the handwriting of a man who had gone to school in a different era, when penmanship was still considered a form of character. Clear and upright, slightly formal, with the particular loops he made on his capital letters that she had loved since childhood. He wrote, My Renata. I'm writing this the winter after the diagnosis, when the doctor told me to put things in order and I finally believed him. I want you to know some things before you find what I left you, because what I left you will raise questions and you deserve answers before the questions arrive. She pressed the paper flat against the table. He wrote about the annex. He had purchased the property in 1987, when the company was still small enough to fit into one building and the future was anything but certain. It was a warehouse space, 1,400 square feet on Vela Road, 10 minutes from the main store, bought at a county tax auction for $3,100 from a man whose name he no longer remembered. He had used it for overflow inventory for a few years, then for storage, then not at all. Life got busy. The company grew. The annex got locked and forgotten. But he never sold it. He wrote, I kept meaning to deal with it and I never did, and then I got old and I realized that keeping it was not laziness. I kept it because something in me knew it was not mine to sell. I kept it for you. Not for your brothers. For you. She turned the page. He wrote, There is a room in the annex. It is behind the east wall. You'll find it if you look for the place where the shelving doesn't sit flush. I built that wall myself in 1994 and I built it so that it could be opened. What's inside has been there a long time. I won't tell you what it is because I want you to find it the way I found it, slowly, with your own eyes, and I want you to understand what it means in the quiet of that space before anyone else tells you what to think about it. She lifted the key. The brass was cool and smooth. She turned it over in her palm. He wrote, Your brothers will take what they can see. They have always taken what they can see. But they never learned to look past the surface of things, and that is the difference between them and you. You were always the one who noticed what was underneath. I love you, Renata. The deed is with the key in the envelope. The property is yours and has always been yours. Go see what I kept for you. She sat for a long time after that. The kitchen was very quiet. The frost on the outside of the window had begun to soften in the morning sun, and a thin trickle of water ran down the glass in a slow irregular line. The deed was there, folded small, just as he had written. Cruz Annex, 14, Vela Road, Lot 7. Owner, Renata E. Cruz. He had transferred it to her name before he died, quietly, through the same attorney who had handled the estate. The same attorney, she realized, who had drafted the operating agreement amendment that removed her ownership stake. She would need to look at that more carefully. She would need a lawyer. But that was for later. The key sat on the table beside her cold coffee cup. The morning her brothers changed the locks on the business her father had built, she had lost $4,200 and a job she had given 22 years. She had been handed the end of something that should never have ended. And sitting in her kitchen with the thermos and the frost and the key her father had kept in a sealed envelope for 4 years, she understood that he had known this day was coming long before she had. He had built something underneath. He had been saving it for the moment when she needed it most. She got up from the table. She found her coat on the hook by the door, the heavy one she kept for winter, the brown wool her father had bought her the Christmas she turned 40 and she'd thought was too old-fashioned and had come to love completely. She put it on. She put the key in her pocket. She drove toward Vela Road. The address was on the eastern edge of Córdoba, past the point where the old commercial district gave way to the kind of block that the city's development plans had always intended to renovate and never quite reached. Auto body shops. A wire fencing supplier. A concrete plant with a permanent skin of gray dust on every surface within 100 meters. The streets here were wide and cracked, and the buildings sat back from the road with the unclaimed look of property that had outlasted whatever plan originally placed it there. Number 14 was halfway down the block, a low rectangular building of concrete block construction with a metal roof that had been painted green at some point in the distant past and was now mostly rust and weathered primer. The facade was blank except for a single roll-up door, painted the same faded green, and to the left of it a narrow personnel door with a deadbolt that matched the key she was carrying. She pulled off the road and sat looking at it. The building was not beautiful. It was not the kind of place that invited approach. Weeds had come up through the concrete apron in front and been pressed flat by rain and frost until they lay like a mat against the ground. The gutters along the roof edge had separated in two places and dark stains ran down the block wall beneath them. A rusted hasp on the personnel door hung open without a padlock, which meant someone had been here at some point after her father locked it, or had tried to be. But the deadbolt held. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, the real November cold that pressed through wool and settled in her shoulders. She walked across the concrete apron to the personnel door. She put the key in the deadbolt. It turned. The door opened inward into darkness and the smell of old air, concrete dust, and something underneath it, drier and older, wood and oil, and the particular stillness of a space that has been sealed for years. She found a switch plate on the interior wall and flicked it. A single fluorescent fixture on the ceiling blinked and flickered and came on, casting blue-white light across a concrete floor. The annex was large and mostly empty. Along the left wall, metal shelving units in various states of rust and disassembly held nothing but dust and one cardboard box that had collapsed inward on itself. Along the back wall, more shelving, also empty. The floor was clean despite the years, swept at some point long ago and then left. A faded outline on the concrete showed where a pallet rack had once stood. She walked forward slowly, turning as she went, taking in the dimensions. Her father had said 1,400 square feet. It felt about right. High ceiling, maybe 14 feet at the ridge, dropping to 10 at the side walls. The east wall was on her right. She went to the east wall. The shelving there was different. 3 bays, standard industrial metal, the same height as the others, but where the other units sat a few inches from the wall to allow for anchor bolts, this shelving was pressed flush against the concrete block. Or appeared to be. She ran her hand along the edge of the rightmost unit, pressing lightly against the upright. It moved. Not dramatically, not a hidden door swinging open on smooth hinges. It moved the way something moves when it is resting against a surface rather than fixed to it, a fraction of an inch of give, a soft sound of metal against something else behind it. She leaned her shoulder against the unit and pushed. It slid to the left on the concrete floor, scraping dust and grit, heavy but movable. Behind it, the wall was not concrete block. It was wood. A panel of plywood, framed in lumber, painted the same gray as the concrete walls around it, built to be seen at a glance and dismissed. Her father had written, built it so it could be opened. She pressed the panel. Nothing. She ran her fingers along the edges, looking for a latch or a catch, and found it on the lower right, a simple barrel bolt recessed into the frame, the kind that locks by sliding rather than turning. She pushed it sideways. The bolt retracted. The panel swung inward on hinges set into the frame. Inside was a room. Not a large room. Perhaps 12 feet by 14, low-ceilinged, no window. But someone had put a light in here too, a single bulb on a ceramic fixture wired to a switch just inside the entry. She reached in and found the switch. The bulb was still good. The room came alive. She stood in the entry and did not move for a full minute. Her father had not explained what was inside the room. He had told her to find it and to understand it in the quiet of that space. Standing in the entry of the room in the annex at 14, Vela Road, she began to understand. The shelves along 3 walls held ledgers. Dozens of them, arranged in order by year, the same brown composition ledgers her father had used for the company's early accounts, the ones she had learned to read as a teenager sitting beside him at the counter while he walked her through the columns. Each one was labeled in his handwriting on the spine. The years ran from 1981 to 2003. On the fourth wall, hung in a row with small brass hooks, were documents in plastic sleeves. Contracts, deeds, correspondence, certificates. A framed photograph in the center of the row, black and white, her father as a young man standing in front of a building she did not recognize, his hand on the shoulder of a man she did not know, both of them squinting into the sun. On the floor, at the center of the room, was a single wooden crate. Solid pine, hand-built, the corners joined with square-cut nails of a type she had not seen used in decades. On the lid, in her father's handwriting on a strip of masking tape, the word she had been looking for since the moment she left the hardware store with nothing but $4,200 and an old thermos. Her name. She knelt beside the crate and pressed her palms flat against the lid. The pine was dry and smooth, the wood aged to the color of old honey, and the square-cut nails along the corners had darkened to the shade of iron left in weather. She could feel the grain under her hands the way you feel something made with attention rather than speed, a surface that had been given time. Her father had built this himself. She knew it without needing proof, the same way she knew his handwriting from across a room or his footstep on a stair. The proportions were his. The nails were his. The strip of masking tape with her name was his. She sat back on her heels and looked at the room properly for the first time. The ledgers on the shelves were organized with the precision of a man who had spent his whole life making sure the numbers told the truth. Each spine labeled by year in the same black marker, the same size letters, the same angle of script. 1981 at the far left, running to 2003 on the right, 22 years of bookkeeping. She reached up and pulled the 1981 ledger from the shelf and opened it. The first page was a balance sheet dated February of that year. Revenue from the first month of operation, $3,847. Expenses, $4,102. Net, negative $255. Beside the figure, in a different ink, added later, her father had written a single word in the margin. Good. She closed the ledger and held it against her chest. He had kept the first year's books and called a loss good. She understood why. He had started with nothing except borrowed money and a truck and the kind of belief in himself that is not arrogance but something quieter, something that does not need to shout because it has already decided. The loss meant he had opened. The loss meant he was in business. The loss meant the thing had begun. She put the ledger back. She moved to the documents on the fourth wall. The plastic sleeves were labeled in the same careful hand. Supplier contracts from the early years, some with companies she recognized and some with companies that had long since closed or been absorbed into larger ones. Correspondence with the county permitting office regarding the original business license, the kind of letters her father would have written himself on a typewriter, formal and precise, never asking for more than what was owed but accepting nothing less. A certificate from the Small Business Administration dated 1989, a commendation for growth and community contribution in Córdoba County. She had never seen this. She had not known it existed. In the center of the wall, the framed photograph. She lifted it from its hook and carried it to the light. Her father was perhaps 35 in the photograph, young in the face in a way that surprised her, his hair still fully black, his posture the upright particular posture he had always carried, the posture of a man who had been told to stand straight at an early age and had never stopped. He was standing in front of a building she could place now that she looked closely. The front facade of Cruz Family Hardware, early years, before the sign was repainted and the awning replaced. The man beside him she did not recognize, older, heavy-set, wearing a jacket with a collar she associated with a different decade. On the back of the frame, in pencil, her father had written, Arturo Vela. The day we signed. 1981, Arturo Vela. She looked at the address on the deed in her pocket. 14, Vela Road. She did not think that was a coincidence. She thought her father had known exactly what he was doing when he bought this property, and from whom. She went back to the crate. The lid was not nailed shut. Her father would not have nailed it shut if he intended her to open it. She ran her fingers along the seam and found the edge where the lid sat in a shallow rabbet, a woodworking joint that held the lid level and closed but lifted free without tools. She worked her fingers under the front edge and lifted. The smell that came up was paper and cedar and the faint particular sweetness of old currency. She recognized the last smell before she saw the source of it, the way the body remembers things ahead of the mind. Inside the crate, packed in careful layers, were 4 things. The first was a bundle of papers tied with a brown cord, the same cord her father used to bundle receipts and contracts. She pulled the cord loose and spread the papers on the floor. Deeds. Property deeds, 7 of them, each one recorded with the county, each one transferred into her name. Not recently. The earliest was dated 2001, the most recent 2003, the year he had stopped adding to the Annex ledgers. He had been doing this for 2 years before his diagnosis, quietly, one property at a time. She sat on the floor and spread the deeds in a row. 7 parcels. She recognized none of the addresses at first. Then she looked more carefully at the third deed and saw the street and understood. They were all in Córdoba County. Some were in the Eastern District, near where she was sitting now. 2 were in the Northern Quarter, near the old warehouse district. 1 was a commercial lot on Barrera Street, 3 blocks from Cruz Family Hardware. Her father had been buying land. Not expensive land, not development-ready parcels with sewer connections and zoning approvals. He had been buying the overlooked kind, the tax-delinquent kind, the kind that sat on county auction lists year after year because nobody saw use for them. He had bought 7 pieces of land over 2 years and put every one of them in her name and told no one. She sat with the deeds in her lap for a long time. The second item in the crate was a smaller wooden box, hinged at the back, the kind her father made for storing the things he did not want to keep loose. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in a square of chamois cloth, was a stack of savings bonds. She counted them carefully, handling each one by its edges. 31 bonds, a mix of denominations, some dated as far back as 1988, the earliest years of the company, when a few $100s a month put into paper bonds would have required real sacrifice. She did not know the current values. She would need to find out. She thought about her father buying savings bonds in 1988. The company was 7 years old. She had been 17. She had been working the counter on weekends, learning the inventory system, learning the supplier names, learning the particular patience required for customers who came in angry about a wrong order or a delayed delivery. She had not known that on the same afternoon she was learning the business, her father was putting money away for her in paper bonds that he kept in a wooden box in a sealed room that no one else knew existed. She pressed the chamois cloth between her palms. The third item was a journal. Not a business ledger, not an accounts book, but a personal journal, a small hardcover notebook with a dark blue cover and a red ribbon marker. She opened to the first page. Her father's handwriting, smaller here than in the ledgers, more private, the letters pressed lightly as though he had not wanted the pen to make too much noise. The entry was dated March of 2002. He had written, "I've been thinking about the difference between what I built and what I own. The company is built. The land is owned. What I built can be taken. What is owned is harder to take, if the owner knows what they have. I want Renata to know what she has." She turned pages slowly. Not reading every word, not yet, but moving through the journal the way you move through a space you have entered for the first time, getting the shape of it before settling in. He had written in this journal for 2 years, entries of varying length, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes a single line. He wrote about the land purchases, about the specific reasoning behind each parcel, about the county records he had studied, about the conversations he had with county assessors and tax attorneys whose names she could look up. He wrote about the company and about Marcos and Dario in the careful way of a man who loves his children and has stopped pretending not to see them clearly. She found the entry she was looking for near the middle of the journal. He had written, "Marcos believes the company is his because he is the eldest. Dario believes it belongs to whoever can hold it. Neither of them is wrong about how they see the world. But the world they see is only the surface. They look at the hardware store and see revenue and inventory and a name on a sign. Renata looks at it and sees the people who built it and what it cost them and what it owes. I don't know how to give her that kind of seeing. I think she was born with it. What I can do is make sure that when they take the surface of things, there is something underneath that they cannot reach. She read the entry twice. Then she sat on the concrete floor of the sealed room, her father's journal open across her knees, the deeds spread around her, the bonds in their chamois cloth, the crate open at her side, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and held everything in with the specific tight restraint of a woman who has been holding things in for most of her life and knows the cost of letting go in the wrong place. This was not the wrong place. This was exactly the right place. She let go. She cried in the sealed room her father had built for her, surrounded by the evidence of his long patient love, and nobody saw it and nobody interrupted it, and when it was finished she wiped her face with the sleeve of her brown wool coat and sat for a while longer in the quiet. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Somewhere outside, a truck moved along Vela Road and the sound of it faded into distance. She looked at the fourth item in the crate. She had been aware of it since she opened the lid, the way you are aware of the last and most significant thing in a room even before you turn to face it. It was an envelope, larger than the others, legal size, sealed with tape rather than its own flap, her father's way of sealing things he did not want accidentally opened. Her name on the front, the same handwriting, the same careful capitals. She peeled the tape back and opened it. Inside were 2 documents and a second, smaller envelope. The first document was a letter from the attorney's office, dated 18 months before her father's death. She read it carefully. It confirmed the transfer of the 7 parcels into her name, confirmed the recording of the deeds with the county, and noted the establishment of a trust structure that held the savings bonds in her name as sole beneficiary. The attorney's name was Ramirez. Not the same attorney who had handled the estate and drafted the operating agreement amendment. A different attorney, engaged specifically for this purpose, engaged in secret. Her father had been careful. He had been more careful than she had known. The second document was a valuation summary, also prepared by the attorney's office, with figures provided by a commercial real estate appraiser. It was dated 14 months before his death. She read the figures once, then read them again. The 7 parcels, valued at the time of the appraisal, totaled $4 million. That was 4 years ago. She folded the valuation summary and pressed it flat against her knee. The concrete was cold beneath her. Outside, the November sky had moved past noon and the light coming under the personnel door had flattened to the gray of mid-afternoon. She opened the smaller envelope. 1 page. Her father's handwriting again, but slower here, the letters less steady, written she guessed in the last months when the medication had begun to affect his hands. He had written with effort and it showed in every line and she loved him more for it. He wrote, Renata. If you are reading this, then something has happened that I prepared for but hoped would not. I know your brothers. I have always known your brothers. I want you to understand that I love them and I am not giving them less to punish them. I am giving you this because you are the one who will know what to do with it. Marcos and Dario will take the company and believe they have taken everything. Let them believe it. She pressed the page flat. He wrote, the land on Barrera Street is the important one. I bought it in 2003 for $11,000 from a man named Gutierrez who had been trying to sell it for 6 years and was grateful for the offer. I bought it because I knew something about Barrera Street that Gutierrez did not and that your brothers, if they ever look, will not understand until it is too late. There is a county infrastructure report from 2001 in the bundle with the deeds. Read it. Then go see the land. Then decide what it is worth. She found the county report in the bundle with the deeds. She had not looked at it carefully on first pass. She spread it on the floor now. It was a planning department document, dense with bureaucratic language, the kind of document that sits in public records and is never read because nobody thinks it concerns them. It was a road expansion proposal. The county planned to widen Barrera Street into a 4-lane arterial connecting the Eastern District to the regional highway system. The proposal was dated 2001. The projected timeline was 12 to 15 years. She looked at the deed for the Barrera Street lot. Commercial zoning. 4,800 square feet, fronting directly on the proposed expansion corridor. Her father had bought the land in 2003. The road expansion, if it had proceeded on schedule, would be approaching completion or already underway. She did not know the current status of the project. She did not know current land values on Barrera Street. She did not know what 4,800 square feet of commercial frontage on a 4-lane arterial in Córdoba County was worth today compared to the $11,000 her father had paid for it 12 years ago. But she understood what her father had done. He had read a county planning report that nobody else had bothered to read. He had bought overlooked land at a tax auction price from a man who was tired of waiting. He had transferred it to his daughter's name and sealed the paperwork in a wooden crate behind a false wall in a building on a street that shared the name of the man who had been his first partner and his first lesson in what trust costs when it is misplaced. He had been patient for 20 years. He had known that his sons would take the surface and leave the depth. Renata gathered the documents from the floor and stacked them carefully, the deeds in order, the bonds in their cloth, the journal, the letters, the valuation, the county report. She placed everything back in the crate in the same careful layers her father had arranged them, not because she needed to put them away but because handling them that way felt right, felt like the appropriate response to the care with which they had been prepared. Then she stood up slowly, her knees protesting the concrete, and looked at the room one more time. She needed a lawyer. Not Dario's attorney, not the estate attorney, not anyone her family had ever used. She needed someone who had never heard the name Cruz Family Hardware and had no reason to be careful around any Cruz except her. She needed someone who would look at these documents with clean eyes and tell her what she actually held. She needed to see the land. She needed, before anything else, to find out what had happened to the Barrera Street Road expansion. She turned off the light in the sealed room. She pulled the plywood panel closed behind her and felt the bolt click back into place. She pushed the shelving unit back against the wall. Standing in the outer room of the annex, she looked around at the empty space, the rusted shelving, the collapsed cardboard box, the concrete floor swept clean by her father's hands years ago. She turned off the fluorescent light. She pulled the personnel door shut behind her. She locked the deadbolt and felt the key turn solid and true in the lock. Outside, the November afternoon had gone pale and still. Her car sat where she had left it. Across the road, the concrete plant ran its machinery in a constant low vibration that pressed against the air. She stood on the concrete apron with her father's key in her fist and the crate contents in her bag and looked at the annex. It was an ugly building. Low and gray and rusted along the roofline, sitting on a cracked apron in a part of the city that development had always meant to reach and never had. Her brothers, if they had ever driven down Vela Road and seen it, would have seen nothing worth stopping for. That was the whole point. She got in her car. She drove toward the center of Córdoba, toward the address she had found in her phone for the county planning department office, because that was where the road expansion records would be and she was not going to sit with uncertainty when the answer was 20 minutes away. The planning department occupied the third floor of the county administration building, a 1970s block construction with narrow windows and an elevator that opened 2 inches below floor level so that you always had to step up coming out of it. The clerk at the records window was a young woman with a phone on her desk that rang every 4 minutes. Renata waited while she answered it twice, then asked for the current status of the Barrera Street arterial expansion. The clerk looked it up without much interest. She printed a single page and slid it under the window. The expansion had been approved for final construction funding in 2019. Contracts had been awarded in the spring. Groundbreaking was scheduled for the following March. Renata looked at the page. The Barrera Street expansion was 6 months from breaking ground. She drove to Barrera Street. She parked at the curb across from the lot. It was a flat parcel between a vacant dry cleaning storefront and a small engine repair shop, fenced on 2 sides with chain link, the surface covered in dead grass and the compressed gravel of a parking area that had not been used in years. There was nothing remarkable about it on its surface. But it fronted 48 feet on a street that was about to become a 4-lane arterial. And the commercial corridor along that route, once the expansion was completed, would be the primary connection between the Eastern Industrial District and the regional highway. Every contractor, every supplier, every delivery truck that had been using the back roads to avoid Barrera's bottleneck would have direct access. The commercial value of a well-positioned storefront on that corridor would not be what it was today. She sat looking at the chain-link fence and the dead grass and thought about Cruz Family Hardware, 3 blocks away, sitting on a smaller street with a loading bay that faced the wrong direction for the new traffic pattern and an ownership that had just consolidated itself into 2 people who had never once read a county planning report. Her father had bought her the future. He had bought it for $11,000 from a tired man named Gutierrez and put it in her name and sealed the proof of it behind a false wall and trusted that when the time came she would find it and she would know what it was. She sat in the car for 20 minutes. The light continued to fade. The dry cleaners across the street had a hand-lettered sign in the window that said closed but did not say permanently. A pigeon walked along the top of the chain-link fence with the complete indifference of a creature that has never heard of a county infrastructure report. She called a lawyer. She had used a woman named Dolores Ibarra twice over the years, once for a lease dispute and once when a supplier had tried to hold her personally liable for a cancelled order. Dolores was straightforward, careful with detail, and charged by the hour rather than by outcome, which Renata had always found reassuring. She answered on the 3rd ring. Renata explained as much as she could in the parking lot on Barrera Street. The sealed room. The deeds. The bonds. The valuation. The road expansion. The operating agreement amendment. The $4,200 severance and the 2 men with the clipboard. Dolores was quiet for a moment when she finished. Then she said, "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" Renata said yes. She drove back to the yellow house on the east side. Peta's light was on next door and she could smell something cooking, the garlic and pepper smell of Peta's kitchen in the evenings. She sat in her car for a moment before going inside, looking at her house, the broken gutter, the garden they had put in together, the kitchen light she had left on that morning when she drove to the hardware store expecting an ordinary Monday. She thought about her brothers behind the locked door of Cruz Family Hardware, counting inventory, reading contracts, believing they had taken everything there was to take. She thought about her father at a county auction in 2003, bidding $11,000 on a piece of dead grass on Barrera Street because he had read a document nobody else had bothered to read, and smiling to himself on the drive home the way she imagined he had smiled, quietly, with the patience of a man who builds things meant to outlast him. She went inside. She put her coat on the hook. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her father's journal to the first entry and began to read from the beginning. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She read until midnight. His voice filled the kitchen the way voices fill a house when the person is gone but the words remain. He wrote about the early years of the business with a clarity that surprised her, not nostalgia, not sentimentality, but the clean specific memory of a man who had paid close attention to his own life. He wrote about her mother, who had died when Renata was 11, in a single paragraph so precise and so restrained that she had to set the journal down for several minutes before she could continue. He wrote about Marcos and Dario without bitterness and without illusion, in the way of a parent who has accepted his children as they are rather than as he had hoped they would be. He wrote about Renata in a way that she read 3 times and still could not hold steady. He wrote, "She learns a thing once and keeps it. She doesn't show off what she knows. She uses it when it's needed. That is the rarest quality I know in a person. It is also the quality that makes the world underestimate her, and I have made my peace with the world being wrong about my daughter because I know what she will do when it finally counts." She closed the journal at midnight and went to bed. She slept the way she had not slept in months, the deep and surrendered sleep of a person who has stopped carrying something alone. Dolores Ibarra's office was on the 4th floor of a building on the edge of Cordoba's modest downtown, The kind of building that had been offices for long enough that it had stopped trying to impress anyone. The waiting room held 3 chairs, a table with magazines that had not been updated since the previous administration, and a window that looked out onto the roof of a parking structure. Dolores herself was a compact woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a cord around her neck and a habit of uncapping and recapping her pen while she listened that Renata had always found oddly calming. Renata laid everything on the desk. The deeds, the bonds, the valuation, the county report, the attorney letter from Ramirez's office, the journal, the operating agreement amendment Dario had mentioned, and the $4,200 severance check she had not yet deposited. Dolores did not reach for any of it immediately. She looked at the spread of documents and then looked at Renata. "Tell me from the beginning," she said. Renata told her. She told her about the letter in the nightstand, the key, the annex, the sealed room. She told her about the 7 parcels and the savings bonds and the journal and the road expansion. She told her about the operating agreement amendment and the estate attorney and Dario's voice in the hardware store and the way Marcos had kept his face turned toward the window. Dolores listened. She uncapped and recapped her pen 4 times. When Renata finished, Dolores said, "Let me look at the amendment." Renata passed it over. Dolores read it twice. She held it up to the window light the way someone holds a thing when they are looking for something specific. Then she set it down. "You signed this," she said. "I may have signed something. I didn't know what it was." Dolores nodded. "Was it explained to you?" "Not accurately." She picked up the Ramirez letter next and read it. Then the valuation summary. Then she spread the 7 deeds in a row across her desk and read each one, checking the recording stamps against the dates. "Your father had a good attorney," Dolores said. "These are clean transfers. All recorded and confirmed. Every one of these is unambiguously yours." "What about the operating agreement?" Dolores set her pen down. "The amendment was signed under circumstances we can characterize as misrepresentation. You were not told accurately what you were signing and you had no independent legal counsel at the time. That is grounds for challenge." She paused. "Also, depending on how the original agreement was structured, removing a founding partner's ownership stake may require consent that was never properly obtained." Renata sat with her hands folded on her lap. "And the Barrera Street lot," she said. Dolores looked at the county report. Then she looked at Renata over her reading glasses with the particular expression of a person who has been a lawyer long enough to know when the facts are in the unusual situation of being genuinely favorable. "At current commercial rates in that corridor," she said carefully, "once the expansion is complete, a 4,800 square foot fronting lot in that location could reasonably be valued between $380,000 and $520,000. Renata did not respond immediately. Dolores continued. "That is a conservative range and does not account for the development premium that typically follows arterial expansion in that zone. The full picture, including the other 6 parcels and the bonds, the total value of what you have is considerably larger than what was in the original appraisal." "How considerably?" Renata said. Dolores picked up the valuation summary, looked at the 4-year-old figures, and looked at Renata. "I would want a current appraisal before I gave you a number," she said. "But the range we are discussing is no longer in the low single millions." The office was quiet. On the parking structure roof outside the window, a gull landed and stood with its head tilted, the way gulls stand when they are assessing something they cannot yet identify. Renata thought about Dario and the envelope and the measured, careful voice telling her that the severance was fair. She thought about Marcos at the window. She thought about her father buying a piece of dead grass from a tired man named Gutierrez for $11,000 and driving home quietly knowing what he had done. "What do you need from me?" she said to Dolores. "Your authorization to engage Ramirez's firm," Dolores said. "They know the trust structure and the transfers. I also want to challenge the operating agreement amendment. That process will require your brothers to be formally notified." Renata thought about Dario receiving a letter. "Do it," she said. She left Dolores's office 2 hours later with a folder of paperwork and a specific calm of a person who has stopped waiting and begun moving. The November street was cold and bright, the same as the day before. She walked to her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her phone had 2 missed calls from Marcos and one from a number she didn't recognize. She did not call back. She drove to the yellow house and sat at the kitchen table with her father's journal and her tea and a folder of paperwork from Dolores's office, and she worked through the afternoon the way she had always worked, methodically, without rushing, reading everything she had been given and making notes in the margins the way her father had taught her. She called the county assessor's office and asked for current valuations on 3 of the 7 parcels. The numbers she received were not the 4-year-old figures in the appraisal. They were higher. In 2 cases significantly so. She called Ramirez's office and introduced herself. The assistant who answered had her name on a list. She was put through immediately to a man who had been waiting, she realized, for this call for 4 years, holding the trust structure and the records and the carefully organized evidence of her father's long plan, waiting for the day Renata Cruz finally found the key. "We've been expecting you, Ms. Cruz," he said. She closed her eyes and pressed the phone against her ear and heard in those 5 words everything her father had never said aloud, that he had trusted her with everything, that he had arranged the pieces of an inheritance so carefully that the only thing required of her was to find it and understand it, and that he had known, without any doubt at all, that she would. The certified letters went out on a Thursday. Dolores had drafted them with the particular precision of someone who wants the recipient to understand exactly what they are holding before they call their own attorney. Each letter was addressed separately: Marcos Cruz at the house that had been their parents', Dario Cruz at his apartment in the new development on the west side of Córdoba. Each one outlined the challenge to the operating agreement amendment, the grounds of misrepresentation, the relevant statutes, and the existence of the 7 recorded property transfers that Dolores characterized in clean legal language as wholly independent of the company estate and entirely outside the scope of what had been settled at probate. She had also included, in a single paragraph near the close of each letter, a reference to the county planning report and the Barrera Street expansion timeline. She wanted them to understand, she told Renata, not just what they were facing legally but what they had walked past on their way to taking the hardware store. Renata had asked if that was necessary. Dolores had recapped her pen once. "Yes," she said. "It is." The letters arrived on a Friday morning. Renata knew this because Marcos called her at 8:47, before she had finished her first cup of coffee, and she let the phone ring. He called again at 9:15. Then a number she didn't recognize, which she guessed was Dario using someone else's phone because he thought she might pick up for a stranger. She let that ring too. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the county assessor's updated valuation spread in front of her and Ramirez on a call that had run 40 minutes already, working through the trust structure her father had built around the bonds. The bonds had matured. Several of them had matured years ago and continued accruing interest inside the trust. The total current value of the savings bond portfolio, Ramirez told her in the even voice of a man delivering a number he had been holding for 4 years, was $214,000. She wrote the number on the notepad beside the assessor valuations. Then she added the current appraised values of the 7 parcels, which Ramirez had obtained through the same commercial real estate firm her father had used, updated for the present market. The Eastern District parcels had appreciated modestly. The 2 northern warehouse lots had nearly doubled since 2003. The Barrera Street lot, with the expansion now formally funded and 6 months from groundbreaking, had been appraised at $490,000. She added the column. The total, bonds included, was $2.3 million. She set the pen down. Her father had left her $2.3 million in land and savings, assembled over 20 years on a laborer's income, 1 overlooked parcel and 1 modest bond at a time, hidden in a sealed room on a cracked street in the part of the city that development had always meant to reach. He had left her brothers a hardware store with 3 employees, 2 delivery vehicles with 200,000 miles between them, and a lease on the loading bay that came up for renewal in 14 months. She picked the pen back up and wrote one more number on the notepad. $4,200. She circled it. Then she looked at the column of figures above it for a long time. She told Ramirez she would call him back Monday morning and ended the call. She sat with the notepad and the cold coffee and her father's key on the table in front of her and thought about what she was going to do. The question was not whether she had the resources. She had the resources. The question was what her father had built them for. He had not written in his journal about revenge. He had not written about making his sons face consequences or proving anything to the town. He had written about giving her something no one could take. He had written about the difference between the surface of things and what lies underneath. He had written that she would know what to do when it counted. She thought about that for the rest of Friday and most of Saturday. On Sunday afternoon, Peeta came over to the garden. They worked for 2 hours without talking much, cutting back the dead growth from the first frost, turning the soil in the beds where the spring planting would go. Peeta was 71 years old and had lived next door for 30 years and had the particular quality of a person who does not offer opinions unless they are asked for, which was one of the things Renata had always valued most in her. She told Peeta everything while they worked. The annex, the room, the deeds, the journal, the number on the notepad. The letters Dolores had sent. Marcos calling and calling. Dario's silence, which was more unnerving than the calls. Peeta listened. She turned a long section of soil without speaking. Then she said, "What did your father do with the first money the business made?" Renata thought. "He paid back the loan," she said. "Every cent, before the first year was out. Then he hired someone." "He could have kept that money," Peeta said. "Started smaller, grown slower. He hired someone instead." "He always said the business didn't belong to him alone," Renata said. "It belonged to whoever built it with him." Peeta turned another section of soil. "That's your answer," she said. Renata looked at her. Peeta straightened up and pressed her hand to her lower back. "You already know what to do," she said. "You knew it before you found the room. That's why your father left it to you." She went inside when the light failed and the cold came back hard. She made dinner and ate alone and thought about Cruz Family Hardware in 1981, her father behind the counter with his borrowed truck and his negative $255 first month and his single-word margin note. Good. She thought about the way he had always bought coffee for the delivery drivers and remembered the names of contractors' assistants and kept a notebook with 2 columns, the people who had been honest with him and the people who had not, without comment. She thought about what it meant to build something. She called Dolores on Monday morning before calling Ramirez. She told her what she had decided. Dolores listened without interrupting, which was not her usual manner, and when Renata finished there was a pause. Then Dolores said, "Your father would have done the same thing." "I know," Renata said. The Barrera Street lot was the first move. She met with a commercial developer named Estela Fuentes that Wednesday, a woman she had found through Ramirez's referrals, who specialized in mixed-use development in transitional corridors. Estela was 47, direct, with the habit of walking a property while she talked about it rather than standing still, as though she needed to feel the ground under her to form an opinion. They walked the Barrera Street lot together in the cold, Estela moving along the chain-link perimeter with her hands in her pockets, assessing the frontage, the depth, the neighboring parcels, the angle of the street. "This is well positioned," Estela said. "Once the expansion is done, this block becomes the primary commercial entry to the eastern corridor." She paused at the corner of the lot. 48 feet of frontage here is significant. What are your intentions?" Renata told her. Estela stopped walking. She looked at Renata for a moment. Then she looked back at the lot. "That's not what most people do with a parcel like this," she said. "I know," Renata said. Estela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It will work. The numbers work and the location works. You'll need an architect and a contractor and a phased financing structure. I can help with all of that if you want to move forward." Renata said yes. The plan was this. A mixed-use building on the Barrera Street lot. Ground floor commercial, 3 units, sized for small businesses, the kind of businesses that cannot afford the rents in Cordoba's main commercial district but are the kind that hold a neighborhood together. A hardware supplier. A small restaurant space. A workshop or trade studio. On the upper floor, for residential units, modest, well-built, rented at below-market rates to working families. The revenue would not maximize the lot's value. Estella had been clear about that. A purely commercial build with market-rate tenants would generate more income in the short term. But Renata was not building for short-term income, and she told Estella that plainly. Her father had built Cruz family hardware for the neighborhood. He had extended credit to contractors who were slow to pay because he understood that cash flow was not character. He had kept prices competitive because he remembered what it was like to have nothing and to need a box of nails and not have the margin to absorb a markup. He had built a business that served the place it was in, and the place had sustained him for 40 years in return. She was going to do the same thing with the land he left her. The Eastern District parcels were next. 2 of the 7 deeds covered adjacent lots near the warehouse district, large enough together to be valuable but awkward individually. Renata had Ramirez research the current use. One was vacant. One held a single-story structure that had been a machine shop 20 years ago and was now being used intermittently for storage by a man whose lease with the previous owner had never been formally transferred to Renata's name. She had Dolores send a proper notice and then a proper lease offer at a fair rate, which the man accepted by phone the next day with the audible relief of someone who had been expecting something worse. The northern warehouse lots she held. Ramirez advised patience on those. The northern quarter was moving, he said. The city had begun approving mixed-use zoning variances along 2 streets that bordered her lots. If she waited 12 months, the appreciation on those parcels alone would cover the development financing for Barrera Street. She waited. In the meantime, she worked. She had spent 22 years running the operations of Cruz Family Hardware without the title that matched the work, and the skills she had built in that time did not disappear because her brothers had changed the locks. She knew how to read a lease. She knew how to negotiate with a supplier. She knew how to look at a set of financial projections and find the assumption that was doing the most work. She brought all of it to the Barrera Street project and to the management of the other parcels, and she found that working for herself, with documents in her own name and decisions that required no one else's agreement, had a quality she had not experienced in 22 years at the hardware store. It was not triumph. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of a person standing in a space that is the right size for them. Marcos called 11 times in the 3 weeks after the letters arrived. She answered on the 12th call, a Tuesday evening, because she had decided by then what she wanted to say and she wanted to say it once. He did not begin with an apology. He began with a renegotiation. He spoke about the operating agreement challenge as a dispute that could be resolved without lawyers if they were reasonable about it, by which he meant if she would agree to something less than what she was owed. He spoke about the company and about what it would mean for the family name to have a legal action on record. He spoke about their father, briefly, in the way people invoke the dead when they want to invoke authority they have not earned. She let him finish. Then she said, "Marcos, what do you remember about the Annex on Vela Road?" A pause. He said, "What Annex?" She said, 14 Vela Road. Dad owned it since 1987. He used it for storage in the early years. Do you remember it? Another pause. No, he said. That is the whole answer, Renata said. That is why he left it to me. She heard him breathing on the line. She said, "I'm not going to settle for less than what the agreement challenge is worth. Dolores will handle the communication. If you want to resolve it without a court filing, talk to your own attorney and have them call Dolores. That's how this works now." Marcos said her name once more, in the tone he had used since childhood when he wanted her to absorb something that was being done to her, the tone that said this is how things are, as though the saying of it made it permanent. She said goodbye and ended the call. Dario's response came through his attorney. A letter from a firm in the city, formal and precise and slightly more sophisticated than she had expected, which told her he had found a better lawyer than she would have guessed he could afford. The letter disputed the grounds for the operating agreement challenge, cited the amendment as a valid exercise of majority shareholder authority, and argued that Renata's signature, however obtained, constituted informed consent. She forwarded it to Dolores. Dolores called back within the hour. She said, "They are going to argue the signature. I want you to tell me again exactly what you were told when you signed." Renata told her again, the same detail she had given the first time: the estate attorney's office, the stack of documents, Dario explaining it as a tax efficiency measure, a routine restructuring for estate planning purposes, no mention of the removal of her ownership stake, no independent counsel offered or suggested. Dolores said, "I want to depose the estate attorney." Renata said, "Do it." The deposition did not take long to arrange. The estate attorney, a man named Caldwell who had practiced in Córdoba for 30 years, sat across the table from Dolores in a conference room in February and answered questions with the careful economy of a man who has made a mistake he cannot undo and knows it. He confirmed that the amendment had been drafted at Dario's instruction. He confirmed that Renata had not been provided with a copy of the amendment for independent review. He confirmed that the signing had taken place during a meeting that had been described to Renata as pertaining to estate tax matters. He could not confirm that the nature of the amendment had been accurately explained to her. Dolores called Renata that evening. "We have what we need," she said. "Their attorney knows it too. Expect a settlement offer within 2 weeks." The offer came in 10 days. It was not what the ownership stake was worth. Dolores counteroffered. There were 3 rounds of letters, each one tightening the number from opposite directions. On a Wednesday afternoon in late February, 3.5 months after the morning the locks were changed, a final figure was agreed and documented. The settlement gave Renata a cash payment for the value of her ownership stake, calculated against the company's current assessed value, minus outstanding liabilities. It was not a number that made her wealthy. Cruz Family Hardware, stripped of the industrial supply contracts she had built and managed and which were now in the process of being renegotiated by people who did not understand them, was worth less than it had been. The company her brothers had believed they were taking was smaller in their hands than it had been in hers. But the settlement covered the development financing for Barrera Street. And the land was still hers. The groundbreaking on the Barrera Street building was in April. Estella brought an architect named Carver who had grown up in the Eastern District and who designed the building with the specificity of someone who understood what the block needed rather than what would look best in a portfolio. Poured concrete and reclaimed brick, large windows on the ground floor, a cornice detail that echoed the older commercial buildings 3 blocks north. Not precious. Not trying to be anything other than a useful, well-made structure that would still be standing in 50 years. The construction ran 5 months. Renata was on the site twice a week, not to supervise, she did not have that expertise, but because it was her building going up on her land that her father had bought for $11,000 from a tired man on a Tuesday in 2003, and she wanted to watch it rise. The first tenant signed a lease in September. Her name was Gloria Medina and she had been operating a small hardware and supply store out of her garage for 3 years, serving the contractors and tradespeople in the Eastern District who found Cruz Family Hardware inconvenient to reach. She was 38 years old, had 2 children, and had been looking for a ground-floor commercial space in the corridor for 2 years without finding one she could afford. Renata showed her the unit on a Thursday morning. It was 900 square feet, clean, with a loading door on the side alley and a front window that would catch the traffic from the expanded Barrera Street once the road work completed in the spring. Gloria walked the space with her arms crossed, measuring with her eyes the way people measure when they already know they want the thing and are trying to find a reason to be careful. She stopped in the center of the space and turned around slowly. "What's the rent?" she said. Renata told her. Gloria was quiet for a moment. "That's below market," Gloria said. Renata said, "My father ran a hardware store for 40 years on the principle that the business should fit the neighborhood, not the other way around." The rent is what it is. Gloria looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I'll take it. The restaurant space went to a man named Hector Van, who had been cooking out of a food truck for 4 years and had the particular focused ambition of someone who has been waiting for the right room rather than the right moment. The workshop unit went to a woodworker named Patricia Sines, who had been operating out of a rented corner of someone else's space across town and brought her equipment over on a Saturday with the help of 3 people and a rented truck, and when she set up her workbench in the new space and ran her hand along the windowsill and looked out at Barrera Street, she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, My grandmother would not believe this. Renata thought about her father. She thought about the journal entry she had read on the first night, the one about the difference between what is built and what is owned. Her father had understood that what is built can be taken, but he had also understood something she was only now fully grasping, that what you build with what you own is harder to take than either one alone. The land had been hers. The building was hers. The businesses inside it were not hers. They belonged to Gloria and Hector and Patricia, and that was exactly the point. The upper floor filled in October. A family of 5 from the northern quarter who had been on a housing wait list for 11 months. A young couple, both working in the trades, who had been splitting a 1-bedroom with another couple and who moved into their apartment on a Saturday with 2 truckloads of furniture and the particular energy of people who cannot quite believe their luck. A woman in her 60s named Dora who had been in a weekly motel for 3 months after her landlord had sold the building she'd lived in for 9 years, who arrived with everything she owned in a borrowed minivan and stood in the empty apartment with her hand on the window frame looking out at the street for a long time before she turned around and said, It's enough. It's exactly enough. The building was full by November. 1 year after the morning her brothers changed the locks. The Barrera Street expansion completed that December. The road crews finished the final paving on a Friday, and by Monday morning the traffic pattern had already shifted, the trucks and contractor vehicles that had been threading through back roads now moving cleanly along the new 4-lane route, and the Barrera Street frontage that had been a chain-link fence and dead grass for 2 decades was a lit building with tenants and a painted sign and a cornice detail that the Córdoba County Planning blog wrote about in January in a piece about the new corridor development. The planning blog mentioned the building's owner. They got her name right. Marco saw the article. She knew because he drove past the building on a Wednesday afternoon. She saw his car from the window of Gloria's unit, where she had stopped in to discuss the parking allocation for the loading door. She recognized his car. He drove slowly, looking at the building, and then he drove on and did not stop. She watched his car turn the corner and disappear. She thought about what he saw from the street. A full building on a prime parcel in a corridor that was now the Eastern District's main artery. Her name in an article. Tenants who were making something in the space. A structure that was going to be worth considerably more in 5 years than it had cost to build. She thought about what he did not see. The sealed room on Vela Road. The journal. The 31 savings bonds in their chamois cloth. The county report with its dense bureaucratic language that her father had read in 2001 and that Marcos had never known existed. The $11,000 paid to a man named Gutierrez on a Tuesday 20 years ago. The patience that had held all of it in place, quietly, behind a plywood wall, for the day it was needed. She did not feel what she had expected to feel watching his car turn the corner. She had expected something with an edge to it, something that would feel like payment for the morning with the envelope and the $4,200 and the 2 men with the clipboard. What she felt instead was quieter than that and less about him entirely. It was something closer to completion. Not triumph, not vindication, just the feeling of a shape becoming clear, of a thing finally being the size and form it was always meant to be. She thought about her father's journal, the entry she had come back to more than any other. He had written, I kept it for you. Not because your brothers don't deserve good things. They do. But because you are the one who will know what to do with it. She had known. She had gone to the planning department office on a November afternoon with her father's key in her pocket and a question she needed answered. She had sat with Dolores and then with Ramirez and then with Estella, and she had made decisions one at a time, slowly, the way you build something meant to last. She had put 3 small businesses on a lot her father bought for the price of a used car and rented them at rates the neighborhood could carry. She had put working families in apartments above them. She had built a place that served the place it was in. She had done what he knew she would do. The northern warehouse lots sold in January of the following year, when the zoning variances had pushed the valuations to the point where Ramirez called her and said the window is open, and she said then open it. The sale closed in 3 weeks at a figure that settled the last of the development financing and left a balance that she put into the trust Ramirez had structured, where it would sit and be patient the way her father's savings bonds had been patient, waiting for the next use that was right rather than the next use that was fast. She kept the remaining parcels. The Eastern District lots, the machine shop with its newly formal lease, 2 smaller pieces she had not yet developed. There was no urgency. Her father had taught her that by example, 20 years of sitting on land that looked like nothing and knowing what it held. She would sit on what she had and let time do the work that time does best. On a Sunday in February, she drove to Cruz Family Hardware. She had not been back since the morning the locks changed 15 months before. She parked at the curb under the elm tree the city kept threatening to remove. She sat looking at the facade. The sign was the same. The awning had been replaced, a different color than she remembered, a dark green that did not quite suit the building. The loading bay door was up and she could see a partial inventory rearrangement underway, shelves shifted, boxes stacked in new configurations that she could tell from the street were not more efficient than the system she had built. Through the front window she could see the counter, empty in the mid-morning Sunday quiet. She did not go in. She did not want to go in. She sat for a few minutes and then she drove to Vela Road. The Annex was the same, low and gray and rusted along the roofline, sitting on its cracked concrete apron. She unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside and turned on the fluorescent light. She pushed the shelving unit aside and opened the plywood panel and turned on the bulb in the sealed room. She had been back several times over the past year. She had taken the bonds and the deeds and the documents and she had kept them with Ramirez, properly filed, properly managed. But she had left the ledgers on the shelves and the journal in the room and the wooden crate on the floor because she was not ready to move them and the room was hers and there was no reason to hurry. She pulled the journal from the shelf. She sat on the concrete floor with her back against the crate and opened it to the last entry, the one her father had written in the final months when the medication had slowed his hand and the letters were less steady. He had written, "I think about what I'll leave and whether it will be enough. Not the money. Money is just the means. I think about whether I'll leave the right lesson. My father left me a borrowed truck and 30 years of example. I drove that truck until it died and I tried to follow the example for longer. What I learned is that the most durable thing a person can leave is the knowledge that patience is not waiting. Patience is working. Patience is building the small thing and then the next small thing and trusting that the shape of it will become clear when it's needed. I built small things for 20 years and left them for Renata. I trust she'll know the shape." She closed the journal and held it in her lap. Outside, the February cold pressed against the metal walls of the Annex. Somewhere down Vela Road a car passed and the sound of it came through the building and faded. The fluorescent light hummed its single note overhead. She stayed for a while in the room her father had built, surrounded by the ledgers of his careful years, the walls the same gray they had always been, the single bulb casting the same blue-white light on the concrete floor. She did not feel the need to do anything or say anything or mark the moment in any way that anyone else could see. She just sat in the quiet that he had made for her. Then she stood. She put the journal back on its shelf. She turned off the light. She closed the plywood panel and slid the bolt. She pushed the shelving back against the wall. She locked the Annex door behind her. She put her father's key in her coat pocket, the brown wool coat, the one that was too old-fashioned and that she had come to love completely. She drove home. The garden was bare in February, the beds turned and waiting. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of a Sunday morning and opened her notepad to a clean page and wrote down the next thing she was going to build. She had learned it from a man who bought land for $11,000 and saved bonds on a laborer's income and wrote in a private journal that patience is not waiting. Patience is working. She picked up her pen. She began. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.